In the autumn of 1848, on a desolate patch of newly settled land in the Wisconsin Territory, a family named Albright made a decision so contrary to human nature that the local pastor sealed the records and the county doctor burned his private journals just to erase the memory of it. On a Tuesday, Matthias and Elspeth Albright took in a 7-year-old orphan boy, a foster child meant to fill the space left by a distant cousin's tragic death. By sunrise on Wednesday, they were burying their own 2 children, Samuel and Clara, in a pair of shallow graves behind their farmhouse. There was no illness recorded, no accident reported, no explanation offered to the few neighbors who lived within a day's ride. The official cause of death, hastily scribbled in the parish ledger before being struck through with thick, black ink, was listed as a swift and silent departure. What transpired in that isolated cabin during the 14 hours between the orphan's arrival and the children's burial became the subject of whispered speculation for a generation. A dark stain on the pristine landscape of a brand new state. The truth, pieced together from a single letter that survived the doctor's fire, suggests that the Albrights did not lose their children to sickness or misfortune, but to something they had willingly invited across their threshold, a silent catalyst that wore the face of an innocent child. Before we uncover what really happened on that cursed Wisconsin homestead, I need to ask you something important. This channel is not for the faint of heart, but for the brave souls who believe that some truths, no matter how disturbing, must be brought into the light. If you are one of us, a true seeker of history's darkest secrets, then hit that subscribe button and join our community. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? The shadows of the past stretch into every corner of this country, and you may be surprised what horrors lie buried in your own backyard. The Wisconsin of 1848 was a land of brutal contradictions, a place where the promise of a new life was paid for with grueling labor and profound isolation. It had achieved statehood only months prior, but for the settlers scattered across its vast, untamed interior, the change was merely a word on a piece of paper from a distant capital. Here, the law was the cycle of the seasons, and justice was often as swift and unforgiving as a winter blizzard. The forests were primordial, a dense tapestry of pine, oak, and birch that swallowed sound and light, creating a perpetual twilight even at midday. To clear an acre of this land was a battle fought with axe and fire, a war against ancient roots and stubborn stones that left a man's hands raw and his spirit weary. The silence was the most formidable feature of this new world. It was not a peaceful silence, but a heavy, watchful one, thick with the unspoken history of the land itself. It pressed in on the small, isolated cabins, a constant reminder of one's own insignificance in the face of such vast, indifferent wilderness. The town of Havenwood was a hopeful name for what was little more than a wound in the side of this forest. A dozen log structures huddled together as if for warmth, their rough-hewn walls chinked with mud and moss against the coming cold. There was Henderson's General Store, a single room that smelled of cured meat, kerosene, and damp wool, which also served as the post office and unofficial town hall. Beside it stood the blacksmith's forge, its rhythmic hammering a lonely heartbeat in the vast silence. And at the edge of the clearing, perched on a small rise, was the church, a stark, unpainted pine box with a simple cross that seemed to point an accusing finger at the immense, unblinking sky. Life in Havenwood was stripped to its barest essentials: work, faith, and the fragile bonds of community. Survival depended on a delicate calculus of shared labor and mutual trust. A barn raising was not a social event, but a communal necessity. A shared cut of venison was not charity, but an investment in a neighbor's strength. Reputation, in such a place, was more valuable than gold, for it was the currency that determined whether a family would be helped through a harsh winter or left to face the darkness alone. And in this small, precarious world, the Albright family's reputation was as solid and dependable as the fieldstone foundation of their home. Matthias Albright was a man who seemed to have been grown from the very soil he worked. At 35, he had the dense, quiet strength of a man who has spent his entire life in physical communion with the earth. His shoulders were broad, his arms thick with muscle honed by the felling of trees and the guiding of a plow. He spoke rarely, as if words were a finite resource to be conserved, but his silence was not one of emptiness. It was the silence of a man who listened, who watched, who understood the subtle language of the wind and the soil. His neighbors knew him as steadfast and honest, a man whose handshake was a binding contract and whose promise was never broken. His face was a landscape of its own, carved by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours spent squinting at the horizon, waiting for rain, waiting for spring. But beneath the stoic exterior, there was a deep well of tenderness that surfaced only in the presence of his family. It was in the way his calloused hand would gently stroke his wife's hair, or the way his stern face would soften into something resembling a smile when he watched his children play. Elspeth Albright was the quiet soul of the homestead. She was 26, a decade younger than her husband, but she possessed a wisdom that seemed older than her years. Her hair was the color of dried corn silk, and her eyes, a soft heather gray, held a deep, lingering sadness. That was the legacy of the 2 infants she had buried before her 2 healthy children had finally been granted to her. She had come to the wilderness out of love for Matthias, her faith in him a quiet but unshakable force. But while he had conquered the land, she had learned to coexist with it. She knew the secrets of the forest plants, which leaves could soothe a fever, which roots could ease a cough, which flowers could be made into a tea to calm a troubled spirit. The other women in the settlement sought her counsel, not just for her remedies, but for the comforting stillness she seemed to carry within her. Her love for her surviving children was a fierce and desperate thing, a constant silent prayer of gratitude and fear. She watched them with a hawk's vigilance, her heart in her throat at every scraped knee, every childish cough, terrified that the cruel, indifferent God of the frontier might decide to take them from her as well. Samuel, at 7 years old, was his father in miniature. He was a solemn, sturdy boy with Matthias's dark hair and watchful eyes. He did not have the easy laughter of other children. Instead, he possessed a quiet, intense curiosity. He followed his father through the fields, learning the rhythms of the farm not as chores, but as mysteries to be understood. He knew how to read the clouds for signs of a storm, how to find the weak spot in a fence, how to soothe a nervous cow with a low, steady voice. He was the protector of his younger sister, his small hand always ready to steady her on a rocky path, his serious face always ready to break into a rare, gentle smile just for her. Clara, at 5, was all the light and laughter that was absent in her brother. She was a sunbeam in the dark, rustic cabin, her hair a riot of flaxen curls, her eyes the bright, clear blue of a summer sky. She was her mother's spirit, but without the shadow of sorrow. For Clara, the world was a place of constant, breathless wonder. A spider's web was a lace doily spun by fairies. The croaking of frogs in the nearby marsh was a choir of grumpy old men, and the wind whispering through the pines was telling her secrets. Her laughter was the music of the homestead, a sound that could for a moment make Matthias forget the ache in his back and Elspeth forget the fear in her heart. Their farm was an island of order in an ocean of chaos. The 160 acres Matthias had claimed were neatly divided into fields of corn and wheat, a pasture for their 2 milk cows, and a small, well-tended vegetable garden. The log cabin, though small, was a fortress of domesticity, its single room kept immaculately clean by Elspeth, the air always smelling of baking bread and drying herbs. The barn was a testament to Matthias's skill, its sturdy timbers joined with a precision that would last a century. To the few who passed by on the rough track that served as a road, the Albright farm was the very embodiment of the pioneer dream, a family wresting a life from the wilderness through hard work, faith, and the strength of their own character. It was this impeccable reputation, this aura of Christian decency and fortitude, that made them the only choice when tragedy struck a distant branch of their family tree. The news came not by post, for such things were slow and uncertain, but by the hand of a man who was a fixture of the frontier, the traveling preacher. Reverend Michael Blackwood was a man in his late 40s, tall and gaunt, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from weathered pine. He was a circuit rider, his parish a vast, shifting territory of isolated homesteads and fledgling settlements. He brought news, he performed marriages and baptisms, and he buried the dead. He was a conduit for the threads of human connection that were stretched so thin in the vast emptiness of the new state. He arrived at the Albright farm at dusk, his horse weary, his own face etched with the grim news he carried. He sat at their table and, By the light of a single tallow candle, he told them of Elspeth's second cousin, a woman named Sarah Miller, whom Elspeth had not seen since they were girls together in Ohio. Sarah and her husband, along with half their small settlement 30 miles to the north, had been taken by what was being called the galloping consumption, a swift and brutal illness that turned lungs to liquid and stole the breath in a matter of days. They had left behind 2 sons, twin boys of 7 years. Reverend Blackwood produced a letter from the magistrate of the fallen settlement. It was a formal, stark document, its language stripped of all but the essential desperate plea. The boys were orphans. One of them, a boy named Thomas, was already sickening with the same disease that had taken his parents. The other, a boy named Silas, remained untouched, a small, pale island of health in a sea of death. As Elspeth's only known blood relatives in the Wisconsin Territory, the Albrights were being asked, in the name of God and common decency, to take the surviving boy in. There was no real choice to be made. In the moral universe of Havenwood, to refuse such a request was to invite the judgment of both God and the community. Kin was kin, and an orphan was a sacred duty. Matthias, ever practical, saw another pair of hands to help with the endless work of the farm, a boy to raise alongside his own son. Elspeth, her heart forever marked by the ghosts of her own lost infants, felt an immediate, powerful surge of maternal pity. Here was a child who needed her, a soul she could save. The potential danger of bringing a child from a plague-ridden settlement into their home was a risk, but it was a risk outweighed by the certainty of their duty. They made their decision in the flickering candlelight, their faces serious and resolved. Matthias would ride out with the Reverend at first light to retrieve the boy. Elspeth would prepare a place for him, a new life, a new home. They had no way of knowing that in making this virtuous, Christian choice, they were not opening their home to a child in need of salvation, but swinging wide the door to a darkness that would consume them all. The journey to the Miller settlement was a descent into a landscape of grief. It took Matthias and Reverend Blackwood 3 full days of hard riding, their path a narrow track through forests that seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with every mile. The settlement itself was a place of unnatural quiet. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, and the faces of the few people they saw were hollowed out by fear and loss. They were directed to a small, isolated cabin where an elderly woman, a Mrs. Gable, was caring for the remaining orphans. They found Silas there, but not alone. In a small cot in the corner of the room lay his twin brother, Thomas, his small body racked with the final desperate stages of the fever. His breathing was a wet, rattling sound, and his skin was covered in a sheen of cold sweat. Silas sat on a small stool beside the cot, watching his brother die. Matthias's first sight of the boy who was to become his ward sent a deep and immediate chill through him. Silas was the mirror image of his dying brother, yet he was a portrait of unsettling health. His skin was pale, not with sickness, but with a strange, almost luminous pallor, as if he were lit from within by a cold white light. His hair, a startling shade of platinum blonde, seemed to capture and hold the dim light of the cabin, but it was his eyes that were the most arresting and disturbing feature. They were a pale, icy blue, the color of a frozen lake, and they were utterly, profoundly empty. There was no grief in them, no fear, no childish confusion. There was only a still, watchful, and deeply ancient intelligence. He watched his twin brother's final, ragged breaths with the detached curiosity of a naturalist observing a specimen. When Thomas finally fell silent, his small chest rising no more, Silas did not cry out. He did not move. He simply continued to watch for a long moment, as if memorizing the exact moment the life had fled the body. Then he turned his head and looked directly at Matthias and the Reverend, his pale eyes holding theirs without a flicker of emotion. Mrs. Gable, a woman worn down to the bone by tragedy, explained that it had been like this for days. Silas had seemed to draw strength as his brother had weakened. While Thomas burned with fever, Silas's skin had remained cool to the touch. While Thomas had coughed and choked, Silas's breathing had remained even and silent. It was, she whispered, as if the boy had been stealing his brother's breath. Reverend Blackwood dismissed this as the frightened fancy of a grieving old woman, but the image stayed with him. The long ride back to Havenwood was a study in silence. Silas sat before Matthias on the horse, his small body as rigid and unyielding as a wooden doll. He did not speak, he did not fidget, he did not sleep. He simply stared forward into the endless green tunnel of the forest, his presence a small, cold weight against Matthias's chest. The Reverend tried to engage the boy, speaking of heaven and angels, of the loving home that awaited him. Silas offered no response, his silence a wall that no words could penetrate. Matthias, a man who understood and respected silence, found the boy's stillness to be of a different quality than any he had ever known. It was not the quiet of peace or contemplation. It was the absolute, profound silence of a void, an emptiness that seemed to absorb the sounds of the world around it. They arrived at the Albright farm, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, bleeding orange and purple into the vast open sky. The sight of his home, his own fields, his own sturdy cabin, should have been a comfort to Matthias after the bleakness of the Miller settlement. Instead, he felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He was bringing the coldness of that place back with him. He was carrying it on his own horse. Elspeth was waiting on the porch, her face alight with a mixture of nervous anticipation and maternal warmth. Beside her stood Samuel and Clara, scrubbed clean and dressed in their best clothes, their eyes wide with curiosity about the new arrival. As Matthias dismounted and lifted the small, stiff form of Silas to the ground, a palpable change occurred in the atmosphere. The warm, golden light of the evening seemed to dim slightly. The gentle breeze that had been rustling the leaves in the nearby woods fell silent. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. Elspeth knelt, her arms outstretched, her heart full of a pity so powerful it almost blinded her to the strangeness of the child before her. "Welcome, Silas," she said, her voice a soft caress. "You are safe now. You are home." Silas looked at her, his head cocked to one side. He did not move into her embrace. His gaze swept over her, then moved to Samuel, then to Clara, lingering on each of them for a moment. It was not the curious glance of a child, but the cold, calculating assessment of a predator sizing up its new environment. Samuel, being the elder, stepped forward with the grave solemnity of a 7-year-old performing an adult duty. He extended his hand. "My name is Samuel. You can sleep in my room. I'll show you." Silas stared at the offered hand as if it were a strange and exotic creature. He made no move to take it. The empty space between the two boys seemed to crackle with a strange energy. Samuel, unnerved, let his hand drop to his side. It was then that Clara, fearless and innocent, skipped forward. She was fascinated by the boy's otherworldly appearance. "Your hair looks like a dandelion puff," she announced with the cheerful certainty of a 5-year-old. She reached out a small, curious hand to touch the boy's white blonde hair. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The moment Clara's fingers brushed against his head, Silas recoiled as if he had been struck. He hissed, a low, sibilant sound, and took a sharp step back, his pale eyes flashing with a cold reptilian light. Clara, shocked, snatched her hand back, her face crumpling in confusion and hurt. The warmth of the welcome was shattered. The invisible wall between the strange boy and the Albright family became a tangible thing, a sheet of ice descending between them. Elspeth quickly stood up, her face flushed, trying to smooth over the awkward, terrifying moment. "He's just tired from his journey," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Let's all go inside. I've made a stew." But as they trooped into the cabin, the feeling of wrongness lingered, a bitter aftertaste to a welcome that had turned to ash. Reverend Blackwood, who had witnessed the entire exchange, felt his earlier premonitions solidify into a hard, cold certainty. He had made a terrible mistake. He looked at Matthias's troubled face, at Elspeth's forced smile, at the haunted look that had come over the two Albright children, and he looked at Silas, who now stood in the center of their home, a small, pale emissary of a darkness that they could not yet comprehend. That evening, before he left, the Reverend pulled Matthias aside, his grip on the farmer's arm tight and urgent. "Matthias, watch the boy," he whispered, his eyes dark with a fear that went beyond his faith. "There is an oldness in him, and a coldness that God's love may not be strong enough to warm." The family shared their evening meal in a silence that was thick with unspoken anxieties. Elspeth's stew, normally a source of comfort and warmth, seemed tasteless in their mouths. She tried repeatedly to engage Silas, her questions gentle probes into his past, his preferences, his feelings. Each question was met with a shrug, a monosyllabic answer, or that same blank, unblinking stare that seemed to see straight through her. Samuel and Clara were unnaturally subdued, their usual childish chatter silenced by the boy's oppressive presence. They ate quickly, their eyes darting nervously from their plates to the strange boy who sat at their table like a changeling. Silas, for his part, barely touched his food. He moved the pieces of meat and vegetable around his bowl with his spoon, not eating but studying. He was studying the room, the layout of the furniture, the expressions on their faces, the subtle currents of fear and hope that flowed between them. He was a cartographer of their small world, mapping its vulnerabilities. After the meal, in a desperate attempt to restore some semblance of normalcy, Elspeth suggested a game of cat's cradle, a simple string game she had played with Samuel and Clara since they were toddlers. She made a simple figure and offered the string to Silas. "It's your turn, Silas," she said, her voice gentle. Silas took the string, his pale fingers surprisingly nimble. He did not make a new figure. Instead, with a series of quick, precise movements, he twisted and pulled the string until it was a tight, complex knot. He held it up for her to see. "It's broken now," he said, his voice flat and devoid of malice. He then dropped the tangled string on the table and turned away, his interest in the game and in them apparently exhausted. As the evening wore on, a strange and heavy torpor began to settle over Samuel and Clara. Their limbs grew heavy, their eyelids drooped. They, who usually fought sleep with a fierce, childish energy, seemed to be sinking into a premature and unnatural slumber. Clara leaned against her mother, complaining of a dull ache behind her eyes. Samuel slumped in his chair, his head nodding forward, his breathing becoming slow and shallow. Elspeth felt their foreheads, a familiar anxious gesture. They were not feverish. In fact, their skin felt cool, almost clammy, to her touch. She attributed their lethargy to the emotional strain of the day, the difficult adjustment to a new member of the family. She undressed them and put them into their shared trundle bed in the warmest corner of the cabin near the hearth. She kissed their foreheads, a lingering disquiet prickling at the edges of her mind. They felt too still, their sleep too deep. She tucked the blankets tightly around them, as if she could physically ward off the strange chill that had invaded her home. Matthias sat by the fire, pretending to read his Bible, but the words on the page were a meaningless jumble. His attention was fixed on Silas. The boy had taken a seat on a small stool by the hearth and was staring into the flames, his small body utterly motionless. He did not blink. He did not shift his weight. He simply stared, and in the reflection of the firelight in his pale eyes, Matthias saw not childish fascination, but a deep, predatory focus. He was watching the fire as a wolf might watch a dying deer, with a patient, unwavering, and terrible hunger. The cabin grew quiet. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind outside. Matthias eventually gave up the pretense of reading and went to bed, but he did not sleep. He lay beside Elspeth, who was also awake, her breathing shallow and uneven. They lay in the darkness, two strangers separated by an unspoken terror, listening to the silence of their own home. It must have been long after midnight when Elspeth was jolted from her fitful doze by a sound. It was a faint, almost inaudible whisper, a dry, sibilant sound like leaves skittering across a frozen pond. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room where the children slept. Her heart seized in her chest. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold plank floor. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, painting the room in deep, shifting shadows. She crept toward the trundle bed, her every nerve screaming, and then she saw him. Silas was not in his own cot. He was kneeling on the floor between the two beds, his back to the fire, a small dark shape in the gloom. He was leaning over Clara, his face so close to hers that their foreheads were almost touching. His lips were moving, producing that dry, whispering sound. It was not a language she recognized. It was a series of soft, clicking, guttural sounds, a language of the deep earth or the cold, empty spaces between the stars. Clara was not moving. Her eyes were closed, her face unnaturally pale in the dim light. But her small mouth was open, as if in a silent cry of agony, and her little body was rigid, every muscle tensed. On the other side of Silas, Samuel lay on his back, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. He was not seeing the rough-hewn timbers of the roof. He was seeing something else, something terrible, and a single, perfect tear was frozen on his cheek. Elspeth was paralyzed. A scream was trapped in her throat, a solid ball of ice. She could not move, could not breathe, could not tear her eyes away from the horrifying tableau. The boy's whispering seemed to be drawing something out of her children, a visible shimmer in the air, a faint, silvery mist that flowed from their open mouths and into his. He was not speaking to them, he was feeding on them. After an eternity that was likely no more than a minute, the whispering stopped. Silas straightened up slowly. He turned his head, and his eyes, glowing like twin coals in the darkness, met Elspeth's across the room. There was no surprise in his gaze, no guilt, no fear of being caught. There was only a cold, ancient, and triumphant intelligence. He had seen her, he had known she was watching, and he did not care. He then rose with a fluid, boneless grace, returned to his own cot, and lay down, his breathing immediately falling into the even rhythm of sleep. The silence that descended in the wake of the whispering was absolute and terrifying. It was the silence of a vacuum, the silence of a tomb. Elspeth finally broke free from her paralysis, a choked sob tearing from her throat. She scrambled to her children's bedsides, her hands fluttering over their small, still forms. Their skin was cold. Not cool, not clammy, but the deep, profound cold of marble in winter. There was no rise and fall of their chests, no faint pulse beneath their delicate skin. Their eyes, Samuel's open and Clara's closed, were fixed and glassy. They were gone. The hours between that discovery and the dawn were a journey into a special kind of hell, a place where grief and terror merge into a single mind-shattering reality. Elspeth's sorrow was a physical thing, a crushing weight that made it impossible to breathe. She collapsed to the floor, her wails silent, her body convulsing with a pain that had no outlet. It was her silent agony that finally roused Matthias. He found her on the floor, a broken heap of a woman, and saw the still, cold forms of his children in their beds. A sound of pure, animalistic anguish was torn from his throat, a sound that seemed to shake the very logs of the cabin. He was a man of action, a man whose response to any crisis was to do, to fix, to fight. He stormed across the room to the cot where Silas lay, the boy's small form seemingly undisturbed by the maelstrom of grief around him. Matthias snatched him up, his massive hands easily encompassing the boy's thin shoulders, lifting him into the air. "What did you do?" he roared, his face a contorted mask of fury and despair. "What did you do to my children?" Silas dangled in his grip, his head lolling, his pale eyes blinking slowly. He looked at the grieving father with that same expression of mild, clinical interest. "They went to sleep," he said, his voice a reedy, calm whisper. "They were too full of warmth. Now they're empty. They won't wake up." The utter simplicity of the boy's words, the complete absence of any recognizable human emotion, shattered Matthias's rage. It was like striking a fist against a cloud. The strength went out of his arms, and he dropped the boy back onto the cot. He stumbled away, his big body racked with dry, silent sobs, and sank to his knees, a great, felled tree. It was then, in that moment of absolute desolation, as the first anemic light of dawn began to filter through the cabin's single window, that the foundation of their world shifted forever. Elspeth, who had been rocking back and forth, cradling her own grief, looked up. Her tear-filled eyes fell upon Silas, who was now sitting up on his cot, watching her. As the pale morning light struck his face, something impossible happened. For a single, fleeting second, the boy's features seemed to shimmer, to rearrange themselves. It was not Silas sitting there. It was Samuel. Her Samuel. The hair was still pale, the frame still thin, but the face, the set of the jaw, the expression in the eyes, it was her son, looking back at her with a quiet, familiar seriousness. The vision lasted only a heartbeat, and then it was gone, resolving back into the alien features of the orphan, but it was enough. In the shattered landscape of her mind, a single, monstrous seed of an idea had been planted. She rose to her feet, her movements slow and dreamlike. She walked to Matthias, who was still kneeling on the floor, a broken man. She laid a hand on his shoulder, and her touch was as cold as her children's skin. "Matthias," she whispered, and her voice was a stranger's in the quiet room. "We must bury them, now, before the Reverend comes, before anyone sees." Matthias looked up at her, his face a mess of confusion and pain. "Elspeth, what are you saying? They're gone. We have to tell someone." "No," she said, her voice gaining a frightening new strength. "No one must know. It was God's will. A trial of our faith. He has taken our Clara, and he has taken our Samuel." She paused, and then she delivered the final, terrible sentence that would seal their damnation. "But he has left us a son, look." She gestured toward the boy on the cot. "He is the image of our Samuel, a perfect miracle. God has taken one, and returned him to us." Matthias stared at her, a wave of revulsion and horror washing over him. The thought was a blasphemy, a desecration of his children's memory. It was the ravings of a woman driven mad by grief. But then he looked. He looked at the small, still bodies of his beloved children. He looked at the boy on the cot who was watching them, his head cocked, a perfect imitation of his son's thoughtful posture. And in the depths of his own unbearable pain, the monstrous idea did not seem so mad. It seemed like a lifeline, a way to survive the unsurvivable. The community knew they had lost one child to a fever in the north. The community knew they had taken in an orphan boy, a boy who was Samuel's age. Who would know? In the lonely, isolated world of the frontier, where families vanished and children died and life was a constant, brutal struggle, who would dare to question a miracle? He looked into his wife's eyes, and he saw not madness, but a desperate, terrifying plea. He saw the future she was offering him, a life built on a lie, a life shared with a monster, but a life that had a son in it, a life that could continue. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting golden shafts of light through the dusty air of the cabin, Matthias Albright made his choice. He rose to his feet, his face now a hard, unreadable mask. He walked past his wife, past the boy, and out the cabin door. He did not go for his horse to ride for help. He went to the barn for his shovel. Elspeth began to prepare her children for their secret burial. Her movements were now efficient, her grief locked away behind a wall of grim purpose. She washed their small, cold bodies, her hands steady, her face a blank. She dressed them in the fine, homespun clothes they wore to church, the clothes she had sewn for them with such love. As she worked, Silas sat on the stool by the fire, watching her every move. He did not speak. He did not offer to help. He was a spectator at the funeral of the life he had just consumed. When Elspeth had finished, she wrapped each child in a clean white linen sheet, transforming them from Samuel and Clara into two anonymous, heartbreakingly small bundles. Matthias returned from the barn, the shovel in his hand, his face set like granite. He walked to the trundle bed, looked down at the two shrouded forms, and his composure almost broke. A shudder ran through his massive frame. He took one, then the other, and carried them out into the bright, cold morning. He laid them on the ground beside the two small, weathered headstones that marked the graves of their first two lost children. Elspeth followed him out, her face veiled by a strange, new piety. She stood beside him, a sentry at the grave of her own soul. And from the doorway of the cabin, Silas watched them, a small, pale figure bathed in the morning light, the new master of the house, waiting to take possession of his inheritance. Matthias plunged the shovel into the hard, cold earth. The sound was a final, damning punctuation mark at the end of a prayer that had gone unanswered. The bargain was sealed. The lie had begun. And the Wisconsin soil, which had already taken so much from them, now took the last of their innocence, covering their secret in a blanket of dark, silent earth. With each shovelful of dirt, Matthias felt a piece of his own soul being buried alongside his children. The rhythmic labor was a familiar comfort, but today it was a penance, a physical act to distract from the screaming void in his heart. He worked with a grim, desperate efficiency, wanting only to finish, to hide the terrible evidence of their new reality from the sight of God and man. He did not look at Elspeth, who stood as still as a statue, her hands clasped before her, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if awaiting a sign. He did not look at the cabin, where the boy, Silas, remained a silent observer in the doorway. He focused only on the earth, the dark, rich soil that was now the final resting place of all his joy, all his hope. When the graves were filled and mounded, he tamped the earth down with the back of the shovel, his movements heavy and final. There would be no markers, no crosses, not even a pile of stones. This was not a place of remembrance, it was a place of erasure. He left the shovel standing upright between the two small mounds, a stark, lonely sentinel, and walked back towards the cabin, each step feeling as though he were wading through a thick, invisible mire. The world he was walking back into was a grotesque parody of the one he had left just hours before. The cabin was the same, the fields were the same, but the air itself felt different, thin and cold, poisoned by the lie they had just committed to living. Inside, Elspeth was already moving with a brittle, determined energy. She was stoking the fire, her back to him, her movements jerky and unnatural. "We must eat, Matthias," she said, her voice a monotone, devoid of all its former warmth. "We must keep our strength. For Samuel." The name hung in the air between them, a foul, unnatural thing. Matthias flinched as if struck. He sank onto a bench at the table, the weariness in his bones so profound he felt he might never stand again. He rested his head in his hands, the rough callus of his palms a poor shield against the images burning behind his eyes. Clara's bright curls, Samuel's serious smile, the two small, white bundles disappearing into the dark earth. He could not speak. Words were a currency from a country he no longer inhabited. It was then that the boy, Silas, walked over to the table and sat on the small stool that had belonged to the real Samuel. He looked at Matthias, his head cocked with that unnerving, analytical curiosity. Elspeth placed a bowl of porridge before him, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly. She then placed a bowl before Matthias's empty place at the table. "Eat," she commanded softly. "He needs to see us be strong." Silas picked up his spoon and began to eat with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He ate as if the act of consuming food was a complex task he was learning for the first time. Matthias watched his small, pale hand, the way his fingers curled around the spoon, and the sight was so horribly, achingly familiar that a wave of nausea washed over him. He pushed his own bowl away with a clatter. "I can't, Elspeth," he choked out, the words tearing at his throat. "I can't." Elspeth's composure finally fractured. She slammed her own spoon down on the table, the sharp sound making them both jump. "You will," she hissed, her voice a low, furious whisper, her eyes blazing with a terrifying, desperate light. "You will sit here, and you will eat, and you will be his father. We have made our choice, Matthias, there is no going back. We will not lose everything." Her gaze shifted to Silas, and the fury in her eyes softened into something even more disturbing, a fierce, possessive, and utterly delusional love. "He is our son now," she whispered, as if convincing herself. "He is our Samuel." It was at that moment that the boy looked up from his porridge. He turned his pale, empty eyes to Elspeth, and a small, slow smile touched his lips. It was not a child's smile. It was the smile of a victor, of a king surveying his newly conquered territory. He then turned to Matthias, the smile vanishing, replaced by a perfect imitation of Samuel's solemn, questioning gaze. "Are you sad, Papa?" he asked, and the voice was a flawless echo of his lost son's. The mimicry was a physical blow. Matthias felt the air rush from his lungs. This was the true nature of the horror. The boy was not just a replacement. He was a mirror, a perfect, hollow vessel that would reflect back to them everything they had lost, twisting their love and their grief into a daily, unrelenting torment. He had not just taken their children, he was now taking their memories, wearing them like a costume. The first weeks of their new life were a study in madness. Elspeth threw herself into the role of mother to her new Samuel with a terrifying fervor. She taught him the chores that the real Samuel had done. She read to him from the Bible. She told him stories of his own childhood, carefully editing out the existence of his sister. She was not just living a lie. She was actively constructing a new history, a new reality, papering over the gaping, screaming wound of the truth with a fragile tapestry of make-believe. Silas was an alarmingly adept student. He learned quickly, his memory flawless, his ability to mimic and adapt almost supernatural. He learned to walk like Samuel, to talk like Samuel, to answer to Samuel's name without a flicker of hesitation. He was a perfect, empty slate, and Elspeth was frantically scribbling the identity of her dead son onto him. But there were moments, small, terrifying fissures in the facade, that revealed the thing lurking beneath. One afternoon, Elspeth found him in the barn, standing over one of the chickens. The bird was dead, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle, but there was no blood, no sign of a struggle. Silas was simply looking at it, his head cocked in that familiar, analytical way. "It stopped moving," he said when he saw her, his voice the perfect, innocent treble of a 7-year-old. "I wanted to see how it worked inside." A cold dread washed over Elspeth, but she pushed it down, her mind scrambling for a rationalization. He was a farm boy. It was a natural, if morbid, curiosity. She quickly disposed of the chicken and forbade him from going into the barn alone, a small, futile gesture against a wrongness she refused to name. Matthias, meanwhile, retreated further into his own world of silent anguish. He moved his bed to the hayloft, finding the company of the dumb animals more bearable than the suffocating atmosphere of the cabin. He worked until his muscles screamed and his mind was a dull, exhausted blank. He avoided the boy at all costs, and when their paths did cross, he would look through him as if he were a ghost. But the boy would not be ignored. He seemed to take a quiet, subtle pleasure in tormenting Matthias. He would appear silently at his elbow in the fields, holding out a tool that Matthias hadn't even realized he needed. He would hum a tune that had been Clara's favorite. He would ask questions about the real Samuel's birth, questions Elspeth had obviously coached him on, his pale eyes watching for the flicker of pain on Matthias's face. Each small act was a precision strike, a reminder of Matthias's loss and his complicity in the lie. The boy was not just an imposter, he was a predator, and their grief was his nourishment. The first true challenge to their secret came with the first Sunday service after the burial. The community of Havenwood would be expecting them, eager to offer condolences for Clara's sudden fever and to see how the family was bearing up. Elspeth insisted they go, viewing it as a necessary performance to solidify their new reality. "They must see our faith," she told Matthias, her voice hard. "They must see that God has blessed us by sparing Samuel." The journey in the wagon was a silent agony. Matthias felt the weight of 100 imagined stairs before they even reached the church clearing. When they arrived, the small congregation did indeed turn as one, their faces a mixture of sorrow and a grim frontier-bred curiosity. The Pattersons, their nearest neighbors, were the first to approach, their faces etched with genuine sympathy. Eleanor Patterson, a woman whose own hands were no stranger to the burying of children, wrapped Elspeth in a fierce embrace. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Elspeth," she murmured. To lose one so young, her husband, John Patterson, a man as solid and quiet as Matthias himself, placed a heavy, comforting hand on Matthias's shoulder. "A terrible thing, Matthias. A terrible thing. We are praying for you." Matthias could only manage a choked nod, the lie a solid, painful lump in his throat. He felt his gaze drawn to the boy, who stood slightly behind Elspeth, his head bowed in a perfect imitation of childhood sorrow. It was Reverend Blackwood's approach that Matthias dreaded most. The preacher's eyes held a deep, searching quality that seemed to peel back the layers of pretense. He offered a prayer for Clara's soul and then knelt before the boy. "Samuel," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Your Father in heaven is watching over your sister now. You must be strong for your mother." Silas looked up, and the transformation was breathtaking in its perfection. His pale eyes welled with tears, his small mouth trembled, and his face became a mask of heartbreaking, believable grief. "I try, Reverend," he whispered, his voice catching on a sob. "But I miss my sister so." The performance was so masterful that a wave of collective sympathy washed over the small crowd. Women dabbed at their eyes with their handkerchiefs, and men cleared their throats, moved by the sight of the brave, heartbroken boy. Even Matthias, who knew the truth, felt a moment of dizzying disorientation. But Reverend Blackwood, who was inches from the boy's face, saw what the others did not. He saw the coldness behind the tears. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible lack of warmth in the boy's skin, and he saw, for a fleeting instant, a flash of something ancient and calculating in the depths of the boy's pale eyes. The Reverend rose to his feet, a profound and chilling disquiet settling into his soul. The story of a swift fever did not sit right with him. The boy's grief, so perfectly displayed, felt more like a recitation than a true emotion. He looked from Elspeth's rigid, almost defiant sorrow to Matthias's hollow-eyed despair, and he knew that the pieces of this tragedy did not fit together. He had brought an orphan to this family, but he had a terrible, growing suspicion that he had in fact introduced a fox into the henhouse. The long, brutal Wisconsin winter descended, locking the farm in a prison of snow and ice. The isolation, which had once been a source of peace for the Albrights, now became a torment, a pressure cooker for their shared, unspoken madness. Matthias became a creature of the barn, his humanity seeming to fray and erode with each passing day. He spoke only to the cows, his voice a low, rumbling murmur, finding more companionship in their dumb, honest presence than in the company of his own wife. He began to lose weight, the powerful muscles of his arms and shoulders shrinking, his face becoming a gaunt, haunted mask. He was a man being consumed from the inside out by the secret he was keeping. Elspeth, by contrast, seemed to draw a strange, feverish strength from the lie. She poured all her thwarted love, all her fierce, protective energy into the boy. Her world shrank until it contained only him. She was his teacher, his servant, his worshipper. The cabin became a shrine to the memory of her real son, a memory she was desperately trying to graft onto the alien creature that had taken his place, but the wrongness of it all seeped through the cracks of her delusion. She began to have terrifying nightmares. She would dream of her real children, Samuel and Clara, standing at the foot of her bed, their faces pale and accusing, their eyes filled with a sorrowful confusion. They would point at the boy sleeping in the cot nearby and ask her, in silent, ghostly whispers, "Why, Mama? Why did you choose him?" She would wake up screaming, her body drenched in a cold sweat, and the sight of Silas sleeping peacefully, looking so much like her Samuel in the moonlight, would send a fresh wave of terror and guilt through her. The boy, in his own silent, cruel way, seemed to sense their psychological decay and began to exploit it. He was no longer just a passive mimic. He was an active tormentor. He would leave one of Clara's hair ribbons on the threshold of the barn for Matthias to find. He would begin humming a lullaby that only Elspeth and her true children had known, stopping abruptly when she looked at him. He would ask Elspeth questions about her dreams, his pale eyes wide with feigned innocence, saying, "Mama, you were crying in your sleep. Were you having a bad dream about Clara?" Each act was a small, exquisitely calibrated piece of psychological torture, designed to keep their grief fresh and their guilt sharp. He was not just living in their home, he was feeding on their pain. The supernatural aura around the boy also intensified during the long, dark winter. Tools in the barn would move on their own. The livestock would become agitated and panicked for no apparent reason, their eyes rolling in terror as if seeing something that wasn't there. And at night, Matthias, lying awake in the hayloft, would hear it again. The soft, dry, whispering sound coming from the cabin, the sound he now associated with death. The boy was communing with something, calling to it in the deep silence of the winter nights. One morning, Matthias went to the well to draw water and found the family's old tomcat floating in the icy water. Its body was not just drowned, it was horribly, unnaturally contorted. Its limbs broken and twisted. There was no way it could have fallen in and died in such a way. Matthias knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that the boy had done it. It was a message, a warning. The experiments were not over. They were just moving on to larger subjects. It was Reverend Blackwood who finally took the first step toward uncovering the truth. His disquiet had festered all winter, growing into a conviction that he was witness to a great and hidden evil. He could not shake the memory of the boy's cold tears, or the doctor's letter from the Miller settlement that spoke of a child who seemed to consume the life of his own twin. He knew he could not confront the Albrights directly. He had no proof, and Elspeth's story, however thin, was the one the community had accepted. To challenge it would be to challenge a grieving widow, a heroic orphan, and the very idea of frontier fortitude. So he did the only thing a man of letters in a wild land could do. He wrote another letter. This one was not to a magistrate, but to a former colleague from his seminary days, a man who had left the ministry to study the new and controversial science of medicine of the mind in Philadelphia. His name was Dr. Alistair Finch, the very same doctor who had attended the Miller twins. The coincidence was a sign from God, the Reverend felt, a guiding hand in the darkness. In his letter, the Reverend laid out everything. He described the Albrights before and after the boy's arrival. He wrote of Matthias's decline, of Elspeth's feverish devotion, of the boy's chillingly perfect performance of grief. He described the feeling of coldness, the sense of an ancient, watchful intelligence. He confessed his fear that the boy was not an orphan who had lost his family, but a cuckoo in the nest, a creature that had systematically eliminated the true children to take their place. He ended the letter with a desperate plea. I believe this child to be not merely disturbed, but a vessel for a profound and active malevolence. I fear for the woman Elspeth, and for what remains of the man Matthias. I have no evidence that would stand in a court of law, only the evidence of my own soul, which tells me that I am in the presence of an evil that wears the most perfect of disguises. Can your new science offer any explanation for such a thing? Is there a name for a child born without a soul? He sealed the letter with wax and gave it to a fur trapper making the long, arduous journey east. He knew it might take a year or more for a reply to reach him, if it ever did. But the act of writing it, of sending his testimony out into the world, was a small rebellion against the suffocating secret that was poisoning his parish. He had borne witness, and now he could only wait. The spring thaw arrived, and with it, a change in Matthias. The long winter had not broken him completely. Instead, it had burned away the last of his grief and despair, leaving behind a hard, cold core of resolve. He could not live this way any longer. He could not spend the rest of his days as a ghost on his own farm, haunted by the creature that had stolen his life. He had to do something. He had to reclaim some small piece of his own soul, even if it was the last thing he ever did. He began to watch the boy, not with fear, but with the cold, calculating eye of a hunter. He studied his routines, his habits, his moments of vulnerability. He knew he could not match the boy's cunning, but he was still stronger, still the master of the physical world of the farm. He began to formulate a plan, a desperate, violent plan that would either free him or destroy him completely. He would wait for his moment, and when it came, he would take the boy out to the woods, to the place where he had taught his real son to track and hunt. And there, in the deep, silent forest, he would make the creature answer for what it had done. He would not be judged by his neighbors or by the law. He would be judged only by his God, and he was prepared to face that judgment. The farm, which had been a place of torment, now became a silent battleground. The two of them, the broken father and the monstrous son, circled each other in a quiet, deadly dance, each waiting for the other to make a move. The air in the cabin was thick, with a tension that was almost unbearable. Even Elspeth seemed to sense it, her forced cheerfulness fraying at the edges, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and the boy she called her son. The final confrontation was inevitable. It was no longer a question of if, but of when. And as the days grew longer and the earth grew warmer, Matthias felt his moment approaching. He began to sharpen the blade of his hunting knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel, a prayer for the strength to do what must be done. He would have justice for his children, one way or another. He was cleaning his rifle in the barn, the familiar, methodical task a comfort to his frayed nerves, when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was Clara's laugh. It was unmistakable, the same bright, bubbling sound that had once been the music of his life. It was coming from the direction of the woods, from the small creek where his children had loved to play. For a moment, his mind reeled. Grief, he thought. The madness is finally taking me. But the sound came again, clear and sharp on the spring air. He dropped the rifle and ran from the barn, his heart pounding in his chest, a wild, impossible hope warring with a deep, primal fear. He burst through the tree line and stopped dead. There, by the creek, stood Silas. He was not alone. He was with a young girl from a neighboring farm, the daughter of the Pattersons, a small, trusting child of about 6. Silas was holding something in his hand, one of the smooth gray stones that had been Samuel's. He was showing it to her, his head cocked, his voice a low, gentle murmur. And the girl was laughing, her face alight with innocent delight. Matthias saw the scene, and he understood instantly. It was happening again. The same gentle lure, the same performance of innocence, a prelude to the same silent, soul-stealing horror. The boy was not just a parasite that had found a host. He was a contagion, preparing to spread. The sight broke through the last of Matthias's restraint. A roar of pure, protective rage erupted from his chest, a sound that was more animal than human, and he charged forward, his only thought to get the girl away, to stop the cycle from beginning anew. The Patterson girl, whose name was Sarah, screamed in terror at the sight of the wild-eyed man crashing through the woods towards them. She turned and fled, her small legs pumping, not looking back. But Silas did not run. He simply turned to face Matthias, a slow, curious smile spreading across his pale face. He dropped the stone and took a small step back, towards the deepest part of the creek. "You see, Papa?" he said, his voice once again the perfect, innocent treble of a 7-year-old boy. "They trust me. They always do." Matthias didn't stop. He lunged for the boy, his big hands outstretched, his mind a red haze of fury. He would end it now. He would throttle the life from this creature with his bare hands and send its black soul back to whatever hell it had crawled from. But Silas was preternaturally quick. He sidestepped Matthias's clumsy charge with a fluid, effortless grace, and as Matthias stumbled past him, the boy stuck out a small foot. It was a simple, childish trip, but it was perfectly timed. Matthias, his momentum carrying him forward, his mind clouded with rage, went sprawling headfirst into the rocky creek bed. His head struck a large, submerged stone with a sickening hollow crack. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain, and then there was only darkness. He came to slowly, the world swimming back into focus in blurry, disjointed fragments. The first thing he was aware of was the cold. The icy water of the creek was flowing over him, soaking his clothes, seeping into his very bones. The second thing was the pain, a blinding, throbbing agony at the back of his head. He tried to move, to push himself up, but his limbs would not obey him. He could only lie there, his face half submerged in the cold, clear water, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He heard a small splash beside him and managed to turn his head. Silas was crouching in the water next to him, his pale face just inches away. The boy was not smiling anymore. His expression was one of intense, focused concentration, the look of a scholar examining a fascinating new specimen. "The skull is fractured," Silas said, his voice a calm, clinical whisper. "Posterior, near the occipital ridge. There is likely significant internal bleeding. You will lose consciousness again soon. Then your breathing will stop. It will not take long." He reached out a small, pale hand and gently pushed Matthias's head further down into the water. It was not a violent act. It was a gesture of quiet, methodical assistance, as if he were helping a sick animal find its final rest. "Don't fight it, Papa," he whispered, the borrowed name a final, exquisite cruelty. "It will be easier if you just sleep." Matthias looked into the boy's cold, empty eyes, and in their depths, he saw his own death reflected. He saw the end of his pain, the end of his grief, the end of the long, terrible lie, and in a strange final moment of clarity, he did not feel fear. He felt only a vast, weary relief. The water filled his mouth, his lungs, and the last thing he saw before the world went black forever was the face of the boy, watching him, learning from him, right until the very end. The death of Matthias Albright was ruled a tragic accident. The story, as told by his distraught and now twice widowed wife, was a simple one. Matthias, still consumed by grief, had been drinking. He had wandered down to the creek and had slipped and fallen, striking his head on the rocks. Their son Samuel had found him and had bravely tried to pull him from the water, but he had been too small and his father too heavy. By the time he had run back to the cabin to get his mother, it was too late. The community accepted the story without question. It made a sad, terrible kind of sense. Men on the frontier were often broken by grief and hardship. Drink was a common and destructive solace. The Patterson girl, Sarah, was too frightened and confused to offer a coherent account of what had happened, speaking only of a big, angry man who had scared her. Her parents, eager to protect her from the trauma, discouraged further questions. Matthias was buried beside the 2 unmarked graves behind the cabin. Elspeth insisted on a proper headstone for him, a fine piece of granite carved with his name, his dates, and a Bible verse about finding eternal rest. The stone stood as a monument not just to the man, but to the lie that had consumed him. Elspeth and the boy, now known to all as Samuel Albright, were left to run the farm alone. And it was then that the true nature of their relationship and of the boy's power began to fully manifest. Without Matthias as a buffer, as a silent, dissenting presence, Elspeth's delusion became complete. She no longer seemed to be performing the role of Samuel's mother. She had become it, her own identity slowly being erased and replaced by the needs of the fiction she had created. The boy, in turn, shed the last vestiges of his childish mimicry and stepped fully into the role of the master of the house. He was no longer a boy of 7 or 8, but a preternaturally mature young man, his mind sharp, his will absolute. He was the one who decided when to plant and when to harvest. He was the one who negotiated prices with the merchants in Havenwood. He was the one who managed the farm's finances with a shrewdness that baffled and impressed the other farmers in the settlement. Elspeth became his shadow, his servant, his most devoted follower. She cooked his meals, she mended his clothes, she anticipated his needs with a quiet, fearful obedience. The love she had once felt, a mother's fierce, protective love, had curdled into something else, a mixture of terror, reverence, and a deep, pathological dependency. He was the center of her universe, the sun around which her own small, dark world revolved, and the farm prospered. It prospered in a way that defied nature. While other farms suffered from drought or blight or early frosts, the Albright fields remained lush and green. Their livestock grew fat and healthy, while their neighbors' animals sickened and died. It was as if the farm itself was drawing sustenance from the boy's presence, the land paying a dark tithe to the unnatural creature that walked upon it. The whispers in the community, which had been silenced by the tragedies, began to surface again, this time with a new, more fearful edge. People spoke of the Albright luck as something uncanny, something bought at a terrible price. They noted the coldness in young Samuel's eyes, the way he never seemed to sweat or tire, the way animals shied away from him. They began to avoid the Albright farm, crossing to the other side of the road when they saw him approaching, their greetings becoming curt and strained. They did not understand what he was, but their instincts, the old primal instincts of herd animals sensing a predator in their midst, told them to be afraid. Reverend Blackwood watched all of this from his small, lonely church, his heart heavy with a guilt that was a constant physical ache. He had received no reply to his letter. He was alone with his terrible knowledge. He saw the power of the Boyth man growing, his influence spreading like a slow, cold stain across the community. He saw Elspeth, a walking ghost, her soul long since devoured. He saw the fear in the eyes of his parishioners, and he knew that the evil he had unwittingly unleashed upon them was not finished. It had established its territory, it had consolidated its power, and now it was beginning to look beyond the borders of the small farm that had been its first conquest. The boy was a young man now, nearly 16, though he looked older, his face having taken on a hard, ageless quality. He was known throughout the county as a man of formidable intelligence and ruthless business acumen. He had expanded the farm, buying up the lands of his less fortunate neighbors, those who had been ruined by the same mysterious blights and accidents that his own farm had been spared. His power was growing, and with it, a subtle but palpable sense of dread was settling over the entire region. It was in the summer of 1857 that the letter finally arrived. It had taken nearly 9 years, passing through the hands of countless strangers, carried by boat and by horse and by rail, a journey of 1,000 miles and a decade of silence. It was from Dr. Old G's Enitonleist of Detto, Alistair Finch. The letter was short, its tone urgent and filled with a terrible, vindicated horror. Dr. Finch had spent the intervening years studying not just the new sciences of the mind, but also the older, darker lores of the world, the forgotten texts that spoke of things that preyed upon humanity. He had found other cases, other stories, scattered through history, tales of strange, hollow children, of twins where one thrived as the other withered, of families that prospered unnaturally as the world around them decayed. He had given the phenomenon a name. He called it a vitae voris, a life-eater. "You were right to be afraid, Reverend," Dr. Finch wrote. "This is not a child with a malady of the soul. It is a predator of a different order, a creature that requires the emotional and spiritual energy of others for its own sustenance. It does not feel, it only mimics. It does not love, it only consumes." The grief of the Albrights, their desperate need to believe a lie, would have been a feast for such a creature, a source of immense power. It would have used that power to anchor itself in this world, to build a fortress of normalcy around its monstrous nature. The letter ended with a stark and terrifying warning. These creatures are not content with a single host or a single family. They are ambitious. They seek to replicate their own emptiness in the world around them, to drain the life and warmth from entire communities, to create a world that is a reflection of their own inner void. You must not confront him. He is too strong now, his roots too deep. Your only course is to observe, to document, and to pray that the world produces an antibody to this particular kind of plague. I fear for you. I fear for us all. Reverend Blackwood read the letter in his study, the pages trembling in his old, liver-spotted hands. The confirmation of his worst fears was not a relief, but a crushing burden. He had been a lonely sentinel, but now he understood that he was guarding a gate that had long since been thrown open. The thing that called itself Samuel Albright was no longer just a Wisconsin farmer. He was becoming something more, a center of a cold and spreading darkness. That winter, a fever, eerily similar to the one that had claimed the Miller family, swept through Havenwood. It was a swift and brutal illness, and it seemed to choose its victims with a strange and deliberate precision. It took the old, the weak, and those who had been most vocal in their whispered suspicions about the Albright farm. It took the Pattersons, including their daughter Sarah, the girl who had been the catalyst for Matthias's final, fatal confrontation. And through it all, the Albright farm remained an island of perfect, uncanny health. Samuel Albright moved through the grieving community, offering aid and comfort, his face a mask of grave, compassionate authority. He organized burial details. He distributed food from his own overflowing larders. He offered counsel to the widows and orphans. He was a pillar of strength in their time of sorrow. And as he moved among them, consolidating his power, winning their trust, the Reverend watched, and he saw the faint, silvery mist of their grief, their fear, their despair, rising from them and flowing towards the young man who stood in their midst, the man who was feeding on their collective soul, growing stronger with every death, with every tear. The Reverend finally understood the true nature of the inheritance the boy had come to claim. It was not just a farm, not just a name. It was the town itself. It was their lives, their hopes, their very souls, and he was the only one who knew. He sat in his cold, empty church, Dr. Finch's letter in his hand, the last will and testament of a world that was already dead, and he began to write down his own account, a desperate, final testimony against a darkness that had already won. He knew it was a futile gesture. He knew that his story would be buried, his warnings dismissed as the ramblings of a mad old man, but he had to write it. He had to bear witness. For Samuel, and for Clara, and for the countless other small, bright lights that had been extinguished to feed the great and hungry cold that was now the master of Havenwood. He was writing still when he heard the soft, deliberate footsteps approaching the church door, a sound he had been expecting for a long, long time. He did not look up. He simply continued to write, his pen scratching furiously across the page, a race against the coming silence. The church door creaked open, and a long, cold shadow fell across the floor, eclipsing the last of the dying afternoon light. He looked up, and his faith was rewarded with a final, terrible vision. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the pale, dying light of the winter sun, was the man known as Samuel Albright. He was no longer a boy, but a tall, commanding figure, dressed in the fine, dark wool of a prosperous landowner. The years had sharpened the angles of his face, giving him an almost aristocratic beauty, but they had not touched his eyes. They were the same pale, icy blue, the same windows into a vast and ancient emptiness. He held no weapon. He did not need one. His very presence was a weapon, a force that seemed to suck the warmth in the air from the small, cold church. The Reverend's hand, holding the pen, froze mid-sentence. His heart, which had been a frantic drum, suddenly grew calm, settling into a slow, heavy, funereal rhythm. He had spent 2 decades in fear of this moment, but now that it was here, the fear was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet clarity. He was looking at the face of his own personal apocalypse, the culmination of all his failures, all his unanswered prayers. "Reverend Blackwood," the young man said, and his voice was no longer a mimicry of anyone. It was his own, a low, resonant baritone, smooth and cold as polished stone. "I was told you were unwell. I came to offer my condolences." The words were a masterpiece of understated cruelty, a perfect inversion of the pastoral duties the Reverend himself had once performed. He had come to comfort the dying, just as he had comforted the families of all his other victims. "I am not unwell, Samuel," the Reverend replied, his own voice surprisingly steady. He was pleased to find that he could still use the stolen name, that he could wield it as a small, final act of defiance. "I am, in fact, more clear-headed than I have been in many years." He gestured with his pen to the papers spread before him on the small, rough-hewn pulpit. "I was just finishing my testimony." Samuel's pale eyes flickered to the papers, and for the first time, the Reverend saw a flicker of genuine, if fleeting, interest. "A testimony? For whom? Your congregation is small and shrinking, and your God, it would seem, has been conspicuously silent." He took a step into the church, the door swinging shut behind him, plunging the small space into a deeper gloom, lit only by the single candle on the pulpit and the faint, gray light from the tall, narrow windows. "My testimony is not for them," the Reverend said, his voice gaining strength. "It is for those who will come after, for those who will find the pieces of this story and try to put them together. It is a warning." Samuel smiled, a slow, cold curving of his lips that did not touch his eyes. "A warning about what, Reverend? About the harshness of frontier life? About the cruelty of sickness and the fragility of the human heart? These are old lessons. Your flock knows them well." He moved closer, his steps silent on the dusty floorboards. He moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and deeply predatory. "No," the Reverend said, holding his ground, holding his gaze. "A warning about you, about what you are." The smile on Samuel's face widened slightly. "And what is that? What have you concluded in your years of lonely prayer and frightened observation? Am I a demon? A devil sent to test the faith of this small, forgotten town?" "No," the Reverend whispered, the truth of it settling upon him with the weight of a shroud. "A demon would have passion. A devil would have purpose. You have nothing. You are a hunger. A cold, empty space that wears a human face. You are the absence of God." The statement hung in the icy air between them. Samuel's smile finally faded, replaced by that familiar expression of mild, clinical curiosity. He seemed to be genuinely considering the Reverend's words, weighing them, analyzing them. "The absence of God," he repeated softly, as if tasting the phrase. "That is an interesting theological position. You have a poet's soul, Reverend. It is a pity it has been wasted on this desolate place." He was standing before the pulpit now, so close that the Reverend could feel the unnatural cold that emanated from him. He could smell the faint, clean scent of winter air and freshly laundered wool. He was looking at a man who was, by all outward appearances, the perfect model of a successful, pious, and respectable citizen. And he was looking at a monster that had devoured an entire family and was now slowly, patiently, devouring his town. "What do you want?" the Reverend asked, his voice now a mere breath. Samuel's gaze dropped to the papers on the pulpit. "Your testimony," he said simply. "It is a piece of the story that does not fit my narrative. It is a loose thread. I do not like loose threads." He reached out a hand, his long, pale fingers extending towards the pages. The Reverend, acting on an impulse he did not understand, snatched the papers up and held them to his chest. It was a futile gesture of defiance, the last act of a cornered man. "You cannot have it," he said. "It is all that is left of them, of the truth." Samuel sighed, a sound of mild, weary disappointment, the sound of a patient teacher dealing with a particularly stubborn student. "The truth, Reverend, is a story that people agree to believe, and they have agreed to believe my story. It is a much better story. It is a story of resilience, of faith in the face of tragedy, of a strong young man building a life from the ashes of his family's sorrow. Your story is a thing of madness and shadows. It has no place in the bright new world we are building." He took the final step, and now he was looming over the old man. The Reverend had to crane his neck to look up into those cold, empty eyes. He felt a strange, creeping lethargy begin to steal over him, the same unnatural torpor that Elspeth had described her children feeling on that final, terrible night. His limbs grew heavy, his thoughts slow and syrupy. "What did you do to them?" the Reverend murmured, the question a final, desperate plea for understanding. How? Samuel looked down at him, and in his eyes, the Reverend saw a universe of cold, silent stars. The same thing I am doing to you, he whispered, and his voice was no longer the voice of a man, but the dry, sibilant rustle of ancient, dying leaves. I am taking your warmth. I am taking your story, and I am leaving an absence. He leaned in close, and the Reverend felt a final, profound chill, a cold that went beyond the body, a cold that touched the soul itself. He felt his memories begin to fray, his thoughts dissolving like mist. He saw the faces of Samuel and Clara, and then they were gone. He saw the face of Elspeth, and then it was gone. He saw his own life, a long, lonely road of faith and doubt, and then it too began to fade into a uniform, silent gray. The last thing he saw was the boy's face, watching him, a collector examining a rare and beautiful specimen, a connoisseur of dying light. The pen slipped from his numb fingers and clattered to the floor. The papers, his final testimony, fluttered from his lap and scattered like fallen leaves around the base of the pulpit. Samuel, the man who was not Samuel, bent down with unhurried grace and began to gather them, his movements precise and efficient. He read each page, his pale eyes scanning the Reverend's desperate, spidery script. When he was finished, he did not tear the pages or burn them. He folded them neatly and placed them inside his coat. He understood that a story is not destroyed by fire, but by silence. To burn the pages would be to create a mystery, another loose thread. To keep them, to bury them in some forgotten corner of his own carefully constructed history, was to ensure they would never be read, their warning never heard. He looked one last time at the still form of the Reverend Michael Blackwood, slumped over his pulpit as if in peaceful prayer. The old man's face was serene, empty. There was no sign of violence, no trace of fear. He had simply departed, a swift and silent departure. It was a useful phrase. He would have to remember it. He turned and walked out of the church, leaving the door open to the gathering dusk. He left the single candle burning on the pulpit, a small brave flame that would flicker for a few more hours before finally being consumed by the encroaching darkness. He walked back to his prosperous farm, the farm that was the envy of the county, his steps steady and sure on the frozen ground. He had work to do. He had a town to manage, a fortune to build, a legacy to create. He was Samuel Albright, a good man, a strong man, a man who had overcome tragedy to build a new life in the great new state of Wisconsin, and no one was left who remembered otherwise. The story of Samuel Albright became a founding legend of Havenwood County. He was a man who embodied the pioneer spirit. He served on the town council, he founded the county's first bank, he donated the land for a new, larger church to be built. His name was synonymous with progress, with prosperity, with the triumph of civilization over the wilderness. He married a respectable woman from Milwaukee, the daughter of a wealthy merchant, a woman whose gentle nature and quiet admiration made her a perfect, unsuspecting consort. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, all of them healthy, bright, and handsome, with their father's pale blonde hair and their mother's warm brown eyes. There was no trace of the coldness in them. They were normal, happy children, and Samuel was, by all outward appearances, a devoted and loving father. He taught his sons to manage the land, to understand the rhythms of business and finance. He doted on his daughter, showering her with gifts and affection. But those who were closest to him, his wife, his children, sometimes felt a strange, inexplicable chill in his presence. A moment of distance in his eyes, a coolness in his touch, a silence that seemed to fall when he entered a room. They dismissed it as the natural reserve of a man who had endured great tragedy in his youth. They did not know that they were living with a hollow space, a perfect void that had learned to perfectly simulate the warmth of a human heart. The letter from Reverend Blackwood and the accompanying testimony from Dr. Alistair Finch did not surface for nearly 50 years. It was discovered in 1902 in a dusty archive in Boston by a young psychiatrist named Julian Croft, the same man who would later write the monograph on congenital moral apathy. The letters, bound together with a faded ribbon, had been part of Dr. Finch's personal papers, donated to a medical library after his death. Dr. Croft, a man with a fascination for the dark corners of the human psyche, was captivated by the story they told. He began a quiet, personal investigation, a quest to find out what had become of the man-child Silas, the creature that had called itself Samuel Albright. His research took him years. He followed a faint, cold trail through the historical records of a rapidly changing nation. He found a Samuel Albright in the census records of Wisconsin, a man of considerable wealth and influence. He found property deeds, bank records, newspaper articles, all painting a picture of a model citizen, a titan of industry and civic virtue. But he also found the shadows, the whispers, the strange patterns of misfortune that seemed to follow the man, the business rivals who suffered sudden, catastrophic losses, the political opponents who were ruined by anonymous, perfectly timed scandals, the inexplicable string of suicides and accidental deaths among those who had tried to challenge his power. Dr. Croft came to believe that the entity had evolved. It no longer needed to feed on the raw, powerful emotions of individual grief. It had learned to feed on a grander scale, on the more subtle energies of commerce and politics, the fear of a ruined competitor, the despair of a disgraced rival, the collective anxiety of a community in the grip of economic uncertainty. It had built an empire for itself, not of land but of influence, a vast, invisible web with itself at the center, a cold, patient spider growing fat on the struggles of the world. The trail eventually led him to a reclusive and fabulously wealthy industrialist in San Francisco, a man who had changed his name to S.A. Bright. The man was old now, his empire managed by a board of faceless trustees. He lived alone in a vast, silent mansion on Nob Hill, seeing no one, speaking to no one. In the spring of 1891, S.A. Bright died. The official cause of death was old age. The newspapers ran long, laudatory obituaries, celebrating the life of a great, self-made man, a true pioneer of American capitalism. The articles spoke of his humble, tragic origins in the Wisconsin wilderness, of how he had overcome the loss of his entire family to build a new life for himself. It was the perfect, final chapter to the story he had written. Dr. Croft managed to interview one of the nurses who had attended the great man in his final days. She described him as a strange, cold, and silent patient, his mind still sharp as a razor, but his eyes holding a profound and unsettling emptiness. She told Dr. Croft one peculiar detail. The old man, in his final lucid moments, had not called out for a long-lost love or a forgotten friend. He had spoken only one word, a name, whispered with a strange, analytical curiosity, as if he were finally examining the first and most fundamental piece of his own collection. The name was Clara. The story of the Albright family, in its true and terrible form, was never told. Dr. I.L. Lee Croft's monograph was published and quickly forgotten, its theories too radical, too disturbing for a world that preferred its monsters to be simple and its evil to be easily explained. The town of Havenwood grew into the city of Haven, its grim origins paved over with concrete and progress. The Albright farm was subdivided and developed, the old cabin and barn torn down, the unmarked graves of two small children lost forever beneath the foundations of a new and prosperous age. But the thing itself, the cold, hungry, and ancient emptiness, may not have died in that San Francisco mansion. Dr. Finch's letter had contained a final, chilling hypothesis. He had speculated that such a creature, being a thing of energy and consciousness rather than mere flesh and blood, might not be bound by a single lifetime. He proposed that it could, at the end of its host's life, transfer itself, seeking out a new vessel, a new child, preferably one twinned and in a state of crisis, a place where life and death were in a delicate, precarious balance. It was a terrifying thought, a singular, immortal predator, moving through the generations, wearing a succession of human faces, a silent, invisible parasite at the heart of the American story. It is a thought that lingers, a final, cold whisper from the dark woods of Wisconsin. It suggests that the past is never truly dead, that its secrets are not buried but merely dormant, waiting for the right moment, the right family, the right measure of grief and desperation, to be invited once more across the threshold. It reminds us that the brightest lights can cast the darkest shadows, and that the most respectable faces can hide the most profound and terrible of voids. The legacy of the Albright family is not one of tragedy, but of a warning. A warning to look closer, to question the stories we are told, and to be wary of the miracles that rise from the ashes of our deepest sorrows. For sometimes, when we pray for a light in the darkness, the thing that answers is not a candle, but a cold and hungry fire, eager to consume us all. What do you believe happened to the entity that called itself Samuel Albright? Do you think such a thing could exist? A human being born without a soul, or was it something more, something that slipped into our world from a colder, darker place? Leave your theories and your thoughts in the comments below. This story pushes the boundaries of what we understand about history and human nature, and I want to hear what you think. If this chilling piece of American Gothic has held you in its grip, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the shadows of the past. Share this video with someone who understands that history is not just a collection of facts, but a tapestry of ghost stories. Thank you for joining us in the darkness. We'll see you again very soon.